The machine came to a squeaking stop just below the platform, and John traveled down the stairs a little bit, then jumped atop the platform, feeling his flimsy body bend a little bit with the hard landing. There was some sort of rusted walkway that was lined with fence of the same color. He walked along the rusted pathway until he saw some sort of steam pipe coming out of the top. He could tell that this was it. John looked off the side of the walkway to what was underneath it. Lo and behold, lay the block. It was slightly wedged between two pipes. John climbed down onto the floor and reached off the side of the walkway, grabbing the block between his hooves. He lifted it up, seeing the R also encrusted with charcoal, then read what it said. To complete the ritual of trade, you will need your most precious memory to fade. In order to do so, you need to brew an arm of a scavenger and a hair straight from you. A drop of blood goes in that you drew, and then you mix until it turns blue. After that, you'll need to pour right over your head until you drop to the floor. When you wake up, you will have lost, but in your hands will be a reward worth the cost. John didn't know how he could read such small words with his rotting eyes. Then he placed it inside of his belly so that it could fall down inside of his torso. He had no clothes on, as they had rotted or just had been removed before the burial, but he followed its direction and climbed out of the machine. He guessed that he didn't need a pot. Oh shoot. There's there is clothes in the drawing. But he followed its direction and climbed out of the machine. He guessed that he didn't need a pot, as most witches would usually need, so he just guessed that the thick leg he would need to chop off could house all of what he needed. But as of now, he didn't have anything to retrieve that leg with, so he headed back to his body to get the knife he had on him when he died. John made his way back through the basin, then through the graveyard, and he saw where his grave had been and continued past it. The tree was still there, but it had gained a more solidified quality. He could not see as well as he could with his human eyes, but could still make out the general shape of things. John looked down at the cave entrance, which he could see as a dark spot in the middle of an almost black gray that had been very slightly illuminated from the fog in the basin. John headed in. He couldn't see anything, but remembered the structure of the place, and eventually touched something sharp with which he could identify as his body. He felt around his body again, hoping that the puppeteer or anything else didn't rig his own body to explode. He felt for the pocket that had kept his knife in, and he felt the slight incline and could tell that he found it. John knocked it out of his pocket with his hoof and picked it up with the help of the other one. Those things Oh my gosh. Those things were what John hated most about his new body, as they were the things that inconvenienced him the most. John placed his knife inside of his lopsided mouth so he could make his way back to the basin. John emerged back in the opening of the basin, now with the knife. He opened his mouth, dropping the knife back into his hooves, then yelled. It was quiet enough to not attract the whole basin, but loud enough to attract the scavengers within the nearest 100 meters. He heard the shifting of bodies again and turned to face its direction, gripping the knife tightly. A scavenger bounded over the bodies with some sort of starving rage. It, it jumped in the air and flew at John, and he stuck out the knife, turning his head, closing his eyes as he knelt down with the knife outstretched above his head. Oh, well, that's the drawing, but he's not turning his head and closing his eyes, I guess. He is looking directly up. And you see how he is wearing clothes in the drawing. And I'm very hungry this morning. I didn't eat any breakfast yet. The scavenger regretted its move. It could have easily swiped the knife away with its long arm, but instead landed on it with its open arms. With open arms. It was as if it wanted to die, wanted to escape the horrible dystopia. Its obscure eyes went from angry, fearful, then happy as they closed, and John sliced a line right down its belly as its organs reigned gloriously over him. He'd given it peace. John looked around the corner of the basin's crack, finding a void key. He hurriedly sawed at the arm of the scavenger with a knife, now placed it in his mouth as he saw 100 more void keys emerge around the corner. Maybe the ritual of trade would protect him. John reached inside his chest with both hooves, grabbed his heart, then pulled it out. He could still feel what was happening to it even when it was outside his body. He squeezed the thing over top of the arm on the ground, wincing in pain, and then he dropped his heart on the ground, again feeling the pain of it striking the body of another. John reached up again, placing his hooves together again to grab hold of a hair from his mane. He pulled it up as it ripped out of his dying skin, and there was now a tidal wave of void keeks flowing inward at John. He quickly placed the hair inside of the arm of the scavenger, picking it up to mix it around. The void keeks surrounded John, and he squeezed and bit at the arm wildly, whatever would do to get the things thoroughly mixed in. The void keeks flowed over John, enclosing him, and they crashed down on him just as John lifted up the leg and upside down over his head. Chapter 40, Skybreakers. This is getting into endgame story now. The puppeteer had collected all of the compasses that he could find, even going so far as to killing all the leaders to collect them. With the stonemason having the most heritage, all the puppeteer needed to do was send out a few bubblegum spikes and the leaders would snap like sticks. He had found the suitcase up on the hill connected to a strange device. He explored some more and found a body that had been killed by one of the traps he had set while he was stuck inside the bubblegum ball. It was nice knowing that they had worked, let alone that they existed. He'd figured out how to trap other universes so he could watch from inside his ball as they crumbled to dust. But this one proved as more of a challenge, and the weakest link was Blood Lake, so as soon as he conquered it, he would be right on his way to destroying it. But something stood directly in his path. He didn't know where it was, but he could sense its presence. When he found the body lying in the cave, spikes protruding from his face, he could tell that he did something about it, and something was off. He could tell that whatever it was still wandering the planet even after death, and it was something more than a ghost. He needed to find it, as this was the only thing halting his progress to do the same thing to this universe as all of the others. And we are only 7 minutes in. We can read a couple more paragraphs. John had awoken with no harm done to his body. He didn't know what his most precious memory was before, but knew that something was missing for sure now. Around his neck was a pendant. A compass was attached. It was black, but the black seemed to reflect a rainbow, just like oil would. He looked at the top edge where his hands were placed and saw that the compass, labeled up on the top hatch, was called the Compass of Seek. John popped it open as he didn't know what it did. There were some metallic boxes inside that seemed to have different purposes. He didn't feel or know what his lost memory was, but he still remembered who and what his parents were to him, which made him feel ashamed that wasn't his most precious memory. He didn't know what the components inside meant, but he felt that he could do much more. He had an urge to jump in the air, so he did, and John felt that he had some sort of opportunity to do something he could have never done before. He straightened out his legs and bent his toes inward and could feel that he was rising further than he should be able to. The compass had allowed him to fly. John didn't know where to go, so he looked back down at the block. Seeing that it didn't tell him where to go next, so he just decided to fly back to the area where he could slot the blocks into. He flew back where he came from and saw no direct way out other than the holes in the ceiling, but his fear of heights reflex was still kicking in as soon as he reached a certain height. When he thought he was just natural, which he thought was just natural for someone just learning to fly. John flew around the graveyard as he felt a leaf brush past his face when it made its way to the ground. He then flew through the narrow cave where he had died, now somehow being able to see perfectly. John made a quick stop so he could grab the wooden box out of his pocket and then placed it into his open belly so it could sit inside of his torso with the other one. He flew back through the basin with the unfinished flatteners, then out back onto the snowy area. He could have flew down the worn stairs, but had forgotten about them. The void keeks were gone, so he could just fly wherever he wanted in the glacier. John made his way around the side of the glacier where he had come in